Dragonlance, Dragons of Autumn Twilight by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, published in November of 1984. Book 1 of the Dragonlance Chronicles. A group of long-separated friends, among them warriors, a knight, a wizard, a dwarf, and their half-elf leader, reunite in the forest town of Solace. But no sooner do they meet than they encounter a mysterious woman wielding a blue crystal staff of the gods, which grants the gift of healing. The pursuit of this staff and its magic by the dark forces of Lord Verminard will force the companions into a grand saga of chase and pursuit, victory and tragedy and inevitable war throughout the forests, caves, and dungeons of the realm. For dragons are returning to Krynn, and the era of peace is over. Dragonlance, Dragons of Autumn Twilight by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, published in November of 1984, and apparently based on Margaret and Tracy's own Dungeons & Dragons campaign, the novelization of it, so to speak, and the first entry in the Dragonlance Chronicles trilogy, and perhaps even more notably, the first entry ever in the Greater Dragonlance literary saga, which, according to my brief online research, seems to span nearly 200 novels. So quite the little mini literary empire there. So I'm sure that you've heard the the classic little joke / observation about Taco Bell. That all their new items, all their menu, all their little specialty treats are all just the same small handful of ingredients, just moved around in slightly different ways. So this book, Dragonlance, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, it's what I might call a Taco Bell fantasy novel, which is to say that it uses the ultimate traditional generic fantasy tropes. Elves, dwarves, wizards, orcs. No, I think they call them goblins, not orcs, but they're basically orcs. Forest towns, caves, dungeons, a dark lord, just a straight up traditional dark lord. Magical MacGuffins and so on, and just kind of arranges them in just slightly different ways. Particularly, I think the Lord of the Rings, it's pretty much the ultimate thing that anyone who talks fantasy books can do. Is the hackiest, most uncreative thing is, comparing things to Lord of the Rings, that it shows very little imagination as a reviewer, which is okay because I have none and I'm not a good reviewer. But the Lord of the Rings reference, you can't help but have it constantly come to mind. But just arranged in slightly different ways. For example, in Lord of the Rings, our group of heroes meet at a beautiful town of the elves, where humans are rarely invited, and have a meeting with the high elf where they discuss, have a grand council where, led by the high elf, they discuss, what to do about the threat of the Dark Lord and where to go and what their next moves are. Then we move on from that to somewhat later, an adventure through an underground kind of lost city where we encounter, enemy armies and a giant monster. In Dragonlance, we go to an underground city, where we have an adventure with enemy armies and a giant monster. Then we go to a beautiful lost elf village where we have a meeting, a council led by the high elf. So as you can see, very different things. Now this is what you would call some straight up traditional ass fantasy. It is apparently, from what I've heard, the novelization straight up of a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, one which, reading the book, I can imagine was pretty fun and involved one. But you're not really breaking the formula here. And the ways that we do break the formula are just the tiniest little ways. Like, for example, where, another fantasy story might use orcs, they instead use something called draconians, which are kind of like these lizard men with wings, basically, filling the exact same role as orcs. It's funny, when we first meet the draconians, they almost come in as a more threatening, replacement for the weaker goblins, who the characters easily face off and defeat in a first chapter or two. Then we have a whole chapter setting up the Draconians, much more threatening than your traditional goblins. And then just within a few chapters after that and for the rest of the book, they're mass slaughtering, just groups of dozens and dozens and dozens of Draconians all coming in at once. Just no threat. They just beat them all. Just no more problem than any common goblin would be. So the threat of the Draconians doesn't last long. But yeah, this is definitely what you would call a traditional fantasy. That might be the euphemistic way to say a super generic, fantasy. The just the ham and cheese sandwich of fantasy. The most basic form you can imagine. And I'm super immature, so that's basically okay with me. I don't mind it, even as I get into my mid-30s and should be reading something resembling real literature. I would still much rather read this, but yeah, I got to admit that maybe I'd rather read some fantasy that tries a little harder to be different, maybe experiments a little more. But at this point I'm judging a book that's rapidly approaching 40 years old with that kind of observation. So who am I to judge? This book came out before I was born. It's kind of traditional novel, but it also definitely is almost like a traditional, I was about to say video game. That wouldn't be correct. They wouldn't have based it on a video game like this. This was the Atari days, but a tabletop RPG campaign in the way that I would think of, a video game campaign, because it's very much quest centric. Like there's almost, there's levels. We start out in the forest level. We have a little adventure there, a little boss fight, just kind of almost in the town of Solace, there's almost like a first boss, the High Theocrat, who's one of the only main human enemies. Then, we move on to like a road. We move on to like a swamp where they encounter some ghosts. We move on to like, then there's a nice little interlude, with a unicorn. The fantasy gets even more, cheesy, Then we move on to a dungeon, and we move on to, and such. We move basically in a kind of an episodic fashion from location to location, and each one pretty much has kind of a boss encounter, so to speak, and our characters gain some levels and get some new abilities. You read it and you're like, yeah, you could pretty much write this script out in a video game format in a game made today, and you wouldn't have to really reimagine or change much. And if I'm being honest, it wouldn't even be considered like a particularly innovative video game script by 2020 standards. But maybe that's a good thing by 2020 standards. But before we get too much further into it, I guess a good thing to do might be to look at our group of heroes, who the inside of the front cover of the book somewhat hilariously, in my opinion, refers to as an unlikely group of heroes, which kind of makes me laugh, because it's a group of like fighters and knights and warriors and like gifted swordsmen and a powerful wizard and a healer and every race represented, and they're all, they're pretty much all good looking and fit and like athletic and heroic and experienced travelers and fighters. So like, I don't know, what do you think a likely group of heroes looks like if there's not a likely group of heroes? You talk about an unlikely group of heroes, I'm picturing like, like an orc, an elderly orc, an obese one-armed woman, a sickly lad who has never held a sword before and has trouble standing up, a talking sheep, that might be an unlikely group of heroes. No, I think this bunch is a pretty fucking likely group of heroes, actually, but thanks for the input. Front cover of Dragonlance. First up, we have the leader of the group. You may not know him well, but he's finally back to kick some tail. We got a Tanis Half-Elven. His last name is Half-Elven because he's half-elven, and his main conflict is about being half-elven. He's torn between his human and elven halves. He's half-elven, you see. And, I don't know. I don't know if he's torn so much. He actually dislikes his human father, who actually raped his elven mother. So that's a little bit of a dark backstory there. But so he pretty much just kind of has scorn for his human half. But the elves are pretty racist against him in an elf town. It's not called Elf Town in the book, but I'm just going to call it Elf Town now because I can't quite come up with the name in my rapidly deteriorating memory. But they kind of didn't quite cast him out, but sort of shunned him until he cast himself out. really seems like he'd be happier if he was just Tanis full elven and could just hang out with his elf bros. But that's his main conflict, is his inner turmoil. Super skilled fighter, no magic power, just a badass with a sword, a good leader. Very much written as a, Captain Kirk, I believe they described it online when I was kind of looking at the book's Wikipedia entry. And he has kind of a secondary conflict as well, which is too many chicas for his Dika. You see, he's got this elf babe, Lorana, back in Elf Town, and she wants to bone him, right? But then he also has a human boo, Kitiara, I believe her name is, and she only really appears in the backstory of this one. She's not really involved in the main story. We'll see if that changes going forward. I feel like it might. But Lorana is totally into him. Like when they're hanging out in Elf Town before the council I talked about earlier. I mean, Tanis isn't like trying to, get back together. He's not like worried about maintaining his relationship with her. She is trying to fuck him so hard. She's trying to wake him up in his sleep so they can fuck. She's tailing after him. She is DTF, man. She is ready to go. Like every set, she is lubed up. She's ready. She wants Tanis inside her. She wants them to make a 3/4 elf baby. Like every second she's on screen. So that's Tanis's main problem, is too many babes want to fuck him. It's a pretty difficult life that Tanis Half-Elven has, because you see he's half elven. Then we have Flint Fireforge, and I specifically mention him after Tanis, despite not really considering him the second most main character, because he's the one who really fills, I think, the sidekick role specifically to Tanis. His main conflict is, I guess, that he's scared of water. Yeah, Flint isn't a super three-dimensional character, I would have to say. Doesn't really even have any opinions that bounce off of Tanis or difference. He's just pretty much there for a sounding board for Tanis, and occasionally to fight some dudes with his axe in battle. I will say, I will give a certain amount of, he's, obviously, the Dungeons and Dragons dwarf, which is in turn, taken from a Tolkien, from Gimli. But I will say one thing, and maybe this is a way that Dragonlance actually influenced the greater kind of a world of fantasy fiction, is that the specific ways that Flint is used as comic relief, his kind of gruffness, his being in denial of the things he's scared of, that kind of contrast with him and his human companions. Little jokes about that is kind of just, his tough guy with a heart of gold comedy relief. I feel like it's almost more directly resembles, obviously dwarves that would come in future fantasy fiction, like, Brunor Battlehammer from the Drizzt books and stuff, but it feels more like you're reading about the Peter Jackson version of Gimli than the actual one from the Tolkien books, like the specific way he's used his comic relief. So I almost feel like maybe the Lord of the Rings movies actually kind of drew from this, which drew from the original Gimli, so it's almost like sort of a feedback loop. I do think it's possible that we wouldn't quite have the John Rhys Davies interpretation of Gimli as we know him if it wasn't for Flint Fireforge in this book. Next up we have Sturm Brightblade, Mr. Honor. Mr. Honor, I call him, because he's all about honor. He's a knight who's all about honor from a fallen order of knights called the Knights of Solamnia, who wants to restore them and restore his honor. He's a little bit of a stick in the mud, but not even like a comic relief type one like Flint. He's just all stick in the mud, and he gets kind of lost a little bit in the narrative because there's so many freaking characters. The party gets so big. I feel like Sturm kind of gets lost in the shuffle. If you were to ask me what does Sturm do in this book, I wouldn't really have an answer other than he hangs out with the group. Yep, he's part of the group. When the group does stuff, Sturm is involved. That's pretty much the gist. That's pretty much sums up what Sturm does in this book. We'll see what the sequels do. More plot relevant, fortunately, is Goldmoon and Riverwind, specifically Goldmoon. She's kind of they're kind of part of a a destroyed tribe of barbarian folk after Goldmoon ended up with this blue crystal staff that fills the One Ring role as the sort of MacGuffin that the villains are after. Like a lot of kind of One Ring knockoffs, it is more morally simplistic than the One Ring. Whereas, the One Ring had this, it was the source of darkness and you couldn't use it. The blue crystal staff is just pretty awesome healing magic shit. It's good stuff all around. It's good to have. It's good to use as much as you can. It's good to get good with. But, I would say Goldmoon is certainly compared to Flint and Sturm. She's more three-dimensional. She has all these issues personally with, her destroyed tribe, obviously, and potentially being chieftain as they bring the tribe back. And she's kind of the MacGuffin one. And, she's a pretty good character. I did like her. I feel like she gains levels, so to speak, too quickly, going pretty rapidly from barely knowing how to use the blue healing staff, maybe being able to heal a little scrape or like a little, flesh wound with an arrow, to basically being able to bring back people from the brink of death, like bring back people who are blasted by dragon fire and they're melted and their eyeballs are oozing out and their organs are on the outside and they're just a charred, pile of bones and gristle that's half a second from death. She can wave a blue wand and they're healed like it's a Final Fantasy game. You just cast a cure for and them they're back, their eyeballs are back. It's all good. And she goes from that a little too quickly, like she's gone Super Saiyan with healing powers or something. But I did like her. Riverwind, again, I guess you could call this a forward-thinking book on gender issues in fantasy, because Riverwind is definitely 100% Goldmoon's sidekick. He has little agency without her. Doesn't really, he's just kind of a barbarian-y type guy. I could barely even describe his personality. He's just kind of stoic. Just kind of a stoic guy who loves Goldmoon. They're like boyfriend and girlfriend. They're not married right away. They're like boyfriend and girlfriend. There's even this weird little bit where she's like saving herself for marriage. I'm like, lady, you're like fighting dragons and like draconians here. You could die anytime. You just get laid already. Just get laid. Just do it. We have Tanis over here. He's getting, well, actually no, he turns down getting laid. What's that? Why does no one in this book want to get laid? Don't make no sense. But yeah, Goldmoon's all right. Riverwind, he plays a role to develop Goldmoon, but not too three-dimensional character himself. And we saved maybe some of the more interesting characters for last year. We got Tasselhoff. He kind of fills the Hobbit role, like he's kind of like a little person who's part of the group, but I don't know, it's more like a Hobbit meets a leprechaun or something, because he's all about mischief. He's like a little kleptomaniac. He's also kind of comic relief, but not like a gruff, more like a traditional comic relief, like being silly, doing funny lines and stuff, but not like a tiny character like a comic relief might be. He does have a decent number of subplots all the way up through the end of the book. He's kind of doing his own things that are separate from the group, and I feel like the book probably would be duller without old Tass. He does an important role. And then last but not least, we have the twins, Caramon and Raslin. I don't know exactly how the authors want to pronounce it. They're a warrior and wizard duo. Caramon is he's basically Joey Tribbiani from Friends.
How you doing?
Just 7 foot tall and a warrior. He's a big old kind of dumb guy who loves food and he's always hungry and he gets crushes on girls, and he's just kind of a, by himself, he would kind of be a comic relief as well. Just kind of like a big, he has like a bit where like they're at an elf town and they get served all these, fruits and vegetables for dinner. And he's like, where's the meat? Where's the meat? And he's all sad about that. But he actually does have something that gives him some depth, because he's extremely protective of Raistlin. Now, Raistlin is an interesting character, and he's one of the ones here who actually doesn't seem to draw directly from something in Lord of the Rings. Raistlin is a dark wizard, not an evil wizard, because he's part of the group of friends. He's part of the team. He's going up against evil himself, but a dark wizard who is kind of like glowering, has a weird sense of good and evil, weird morality, very uncaring about certain things, uses dark powers. And he gave up his physical health and physical strength to give these awesome magic powers, which, save the companions again and again, like doing stuff like putting huge groups of enemies to sleep and other stuff like that. And he knows more about the supernatural and magical elements of the world. So he helps in combat, he helps with the mythology, he helps with the mysteries. But a lot of the characters are suspicious of him and don't like him so much anymore since his true embrace of darkness. Picture basically if after joining the dark side and getting real fucked up by the lava, if Anakin Skywalker just carried right on as part of the Jedi Knights, but with his new personality and his disabilities. That's kind of what Raistlin is. He coughs nonstop. He can't keep up. He's very physically weak, but super powerful. And it's that kind of dynamic between the group not trusting Raistlin, but Caramon loving his brother and being willing to defend him. It gives the group its spice. If you were to take Raistlin out, I think this book might be so simple and cheesy it'd be unreadable. But Raistlin kind of saves the book, I would say. It very much wouldn't be the same without him. So that's our group, that's our gang. Some all pretty generic, some likable, some a little more interesting. Some like Flint, debatably not really even necessary in the book. Not that I'm get him the fuck out of here or anything, but not adding a ton to the greater narrative. But they work for book one. And when I say book one, I'm not referring to Dragons of Autumn Twilight. You see, technically Dragons of Autumn Twilight is designated as volume one. It is divided up within the novel, I should say, into book one and book two. Each book kind of has a similar structure. Each one starts with the characters kind of at Solace. Each one kind of, then they end up going on a quest outward from there, meeting some other characters, getting a little exposition, then going into a dungeon and into a final boss fight with a dragon. Each one basically follows that structure. Now the first one is the first of the books is probably better in my opinion, even though it's arguably more generic, and I'll get into that in a second, because it kind of has the characters first meeting Gold Moon and Riverwind, first learning about the mythology. The chase starts up a little more breathlessly. It goes into a pretty interesting, cool climax in the Mines of Moria ripoff sequence in kind of an underground city. But then we get into book two, and book two has a big issue. It is that a bunch more people join the party. We got Lorana, the aforementioned elf maiden who wants a Tanis inside her. We have a kind of Gandalf, a more absent-minded and silly version of Gandalf, an old wizard named Fizban. We have a Tika, a barmaid from Solus who ends up on the adventure. We have a Gilthanos, the elf guide. We have a suspicious human named Eben who joins them in the mountains. And we got all these dudes all in one adventuring party, all together at once, all on the same quest, doing the same stuff together. And it's way too crowded. It's borderline comical at points. Something will happen, and then we have to describe for the rest of the page 12 people's reactions to it. It's why splitting characters up for these, cast of tons of characters type fantasies is so good. Splitting people up into different groups. But in here, they're all together. You picture it in your mind's eye, 14 people going through this dungeon together. It almost looks kind of silly and comical. It's just too much of a crowd. And that's why book two, probably not quite as good as book one. Although the one thing I will say is that book two actually doesn't end in really a Lord of the Rings ripoff sequence. It turns into sort of this prison break narrative actually for the climax, which is a little different, a little cool. The kind of boss fights toward the end with sort of a warlock and a dragon, or a little generic. There's for example, I think of this sequence toward the middle of book two, maybe, where they're in a dungeon, a giant slug attacks them, and we spend the next 3 or 4 pages fighting the giant slug. It doesn't change anything about the world. It doesn't reveal anything about deeper characterization. It doesn't fundamentally change the story or send things in a new direction or reveal anything. It's just well, I guess they should fight a giant slug for 4 pages here. It's very much kind of reflects the sort of, this is a game. This isn't really literature. That sounds more pretentious than I meant it to. I don't give a flying fuck if I read literature or not, but it's kind of the sort of thing where it's action scenes are in there so that there can be action scenes, and kind of book 2 seems like it has a lot of that, but the kind of prison break sequence that it ends with is something a little different, and I feel like maybe that's the authors kind of getting into a little bit of a creative groove, kind of working those creative muscles up. Maybe it's straight from the Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Apparently most of it's based on. If so, pretty cool end for a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, I gotta say. And it brought the book to an all right climax. Just I thought book 2 was overly crowded, overly busy in service of a very simple story. I don't mind a book being very busy if the plot has tons going on, but this is like super busy in service of magic MacGuffins and going to fight dragons, and it was a little bit mixed. One thing I will mention that's kind of cool is that it's not an illustrated book per se, but it actually does have a few dozen kind of little illustrations in there at the beginning of each chapter that just like represents one scene or one character from the chapter. I gotta say, I think this is cool. Like, if I had any artistic ability, which I don't, I would do this in my own book. I think it's a neat little idea. I would say that the biggest problem that I personally have with the book is way too much Deus Ex Machina type stuff. Way too much people getting revived from death or from the brink of death. Too much things where that seems like they're too cowardly to kind of go through with things that would actually make the story more interesting. I mentioned earlier a sequence where a character is basically killed by a dragon. Like, there's kind of a pretty graphic description of like their eyeballs melting out of their face, their bones all exposed, charred, smoking. And I'm like, okay, we're doing a little something with the story here. It's not quite, Ned Stark, bring me his head, but we're doing a little something here, or a little something. Oh no, never mind. They're healed. They're revived. Fuck me for thinking something interesting could happen. So it's a little cowardly in that way. I mean, I know it was like the mid-early '80s, whatever. Things were a little different then, but yeah, there's some parts where it's a little weak in that way. A little storytelling, a little too much. We'll just save this person. We'll bring this person back to life. That thing that might have been like dark and change the direction of this, but that's not going to happen. No worry. Too much plot armor. So yeah, that's a little kind of that's my biggest problem. Most people's biggest problem is probably that this is a book for children, but I'm very childish. I mean, look, this isn't an amazing fantasy book by modern standards. Even like there's been books set within the Dungeons and Dragons world since then that have more depth and more creativity and more multifaceted characters in them, definitely. But when I read this, I kind of find myself, it's sort of this thing I call nostalgia. It's when you're experiencing something for the first time, but you find something nostalgic about it all the same. Sometimes I feel this way when I like play like a new NES game or something that I'd never played before. I read this and I find myself thinking that if I had been, like 12 years old, 14 years old in the mid 1980s reading this, I can easily put myself in a mental place where I imagine this would have been the coolest thing to me. I can like imagine, 13-year-old me in 1985 or whatever, like reading this like 20 times and like showing it to my friends and bugging my parents about it, even though they didn't care, and just being like, this rules. I can imagine that, and I can kind of enjoy the book through the lens of this fictional version of myself. That probably makes me sound like a crazy person, but I don't know. That's just how I think of things. I won't go so far as to say that if you enjoy Lord of the Rings, that means you'll enjoy Dragonlance, because honestly, Lord of the Rings is quite a bit better than Dragonlance. But it's Lord of the Rings is maybe a fine, well-cooked steak. Dragonlance it's a microwaved hot dog, in comparison. Maybe if you enjoy kind of like modern gaming stuff like Final Fantasy, Legend of Zelda, Elder Scrolls, and so on, maybe this would appeal to you in a similar way as kind of just your fun little fantasy adventure. But overall, despite the fact that I've kind of criticized and poked fun at quite a bit of this, I gotta say, I don't know. The idea of reading the sequel I somehow find it more appealing than some other books I've read recently. Like, I actually have it back here. Let's see. Yeah, I got a number 2 here. I also never read it before, and I don't know. I'm kind of thinking it might be fun. Maybe I made that little food comparison. Sometimes you just want a goddamn microwaved hot dog. All right. Sometimes you just want a freaking snack that's easy and tastes pretty good. And maybe that's will be what this is. I don't know. I probably won't read it next. In fact, I definitely won't. I already started a different book. But maybe by the end of the year, maybe in a few months, maybe it'll be fun. Maybe it'll suck. I don't know. But yeah. So that is Dragons of Autumn Twilight. If I'm really being honest and judging it as a piece of literature, I don't think I could give it more than a 6 out of 10. But without going too into numerical ratings, which I'm not a huge fan of, I'd probably go a little higher than that for personal enjoyment. But yep, that'll do it for the old book club this time around. Thanks for swinging by. Always a pleasure to stop into book club myself. And I hope to have more episodes of Zeal's book club up regularly. I enjoy doing it. Talk to y'all later.